Hi, this is Betty Plus Books, and this is going to be my November wrap-up as well as my December TBR. I had a really slumpy November overall, and so I only read 4 books, and 3 of those I think were on my November to be read list, but one of them I think was just something I randomly threw in here. So here's what I read. So first I read The Ivies by Alexa Donne, and I think I actually started this at the very end of October. I got through this pretty quickly. It was a pretty engaging story, and this is about a couple of friends who all have a goal of getting into Ivy League schools, but they're each supposed to get into different ones and only apply for certain ones, so that the quota of how many people get in from the school isn't like exceeded and not allowing one of the people to get into the Ivy League of their choice. But our main character really wanted to go to Harvard. That's her dream school, but she wasn't like assigned by the group to try and apply for that Ivy League. So she applies in secret, and then her friend doesn't get into Harvard, and shortly afterward one of her other friends is murdered, and so she's trying to figure out like whether her friend, who's really upset about not getting into Harvard, murdered this other friend or if someone else did it, and that's basically most of the story. I really enjoyed this book while reading it, and so when I finished I gave it 4 stars. It might be more of a 3-star book. Like, it's not like the most sophisticated, but it's also like supposed to be YA. I think on the tails of reading Ace of Spades, which was such a good book. It was one of my favorite books of the year, and it was like a 5-star, and both of those having like at least some similar feelings and like themes to them. It just made the Ivies like seem worse by comparison, unfortunately, but they were really focused on different things. Like, one of the things that I really liked about the Ivies is it had this combination of like making me have nostalgia for like going back to the time when I was applying for colleges and waiting for acceptances or rejections or whatever, while at the same time being like really glad that I am not in that space anymore. So overall, it was a fun book. I did like some of the twists. I thought the way that it ended was really kind of realistic. By the way, if you did like The Ivies or Ace of Spades and like that kind of like mystery in a school setting but would like to see a different point of view, 2 books I really enjoyed where it's in a school setting and there's like a murder mystery or a mystery happening inside of a school, but is from the perspective of like the investigator in part. 2 books that I liked were The Secret Place by Tana French. This is a book in a series, but it's really a series where while there's some integration of characters and there's some spoilers for earlier books in later books, for the most part each individual book can be read individually, and I think this is like maybe the 3rd or 4th book in the series. But I really enjoyed this, and it's from the perspective of the investigator of a murder that's actually kind of a cold case that happened a few years prior. And another book that I really liked with this sort of theme of like there's a mystery in a school happening that has more of a magic twist is Magic for Liars, and I don't remember the author of this, but I'll put it over here. And this is more of like a private investigator rather than a police officer doing the investigating. In those books, I find it really interesting how the investigators like have to interpret these kids' testimonies and their reports of what happened, and thinking about both like their mindset and like what a potential suspect would do, but also like the difference between like what an adult might do to protect themselves from certain things versus what a kid might do just out of like embarrassment or social expectations and things. And I thought both of those were really interesting. Okay, so next we have The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. I really thought I was going to love this book. It has multiple perspectives, but like one consciousness over a series of perspectives wherein this person is trying to figure out the whodunit of the murder of Evelyn Hardcastle. And I don't know why, but this book kind of put me into a reading slump. I didn't really enjoy it much at all, like the process of reading it, even though I thought I was going to love it. I think part of it was I thought all of the characters were unlikable, but not really in an interesting way. So all of the perspectives were like, this person is being put into a body which is just like they kind of hate themselves, which I thought was interesting in premise, but in execution, just I wasn't having any fun with it. I was also listening to it in audiobook, and sometimes just with certain narrators, like the audiobook doesn't really do anything for me, so I think I was struggling a little bit with that as well. But I did finish it. I gave it 3 stars because while I didn't enjoy the process of reading it, I thought there were a lot of interesting concepts. It was well executed, and it's an interesting take on like what makes up identity. Is it like the body and consciousness you're currently in? If you as like your consciousness got transported to another body, which has different physical features, different memories, different like chemical makeup, would that make you that person, or would you still be yourself, or would you be something in between? So if I were going to rate it on quality, I would probably rate it on like 5 stars, but rating it for my personal enjoyment, I rated it 3 stars. So third, I read Invisible Sun by Charles Stross, and I believe this is the second book in the Empire Games series, which is a follow-on to the series of the Merchant Princes series. I really enjoyed the Merchant Princes series, but I had a couple of issues throughout that with Charles Stross's writing of women and just certain things that he thinks are like things that women do, and his interpretations of how women work that I'm like, that's not how women work. But overall, I did enjoy that series. It was adventurous, it was interesting, but this follow-on series is much more like political in nature and deals with basically a lot of global politics and is a lot less on the adventure side. And so I'm enjoying it a lot less because of that. I also feel like in general, I've enjoyed Charles Stross's more recent works a lot less than his works that he wrote like 10 years ago or something. So maybe his writing style is just like changing to the point where I don't like it as well, but I think a lot of it was just the political aspects that monopolized a lot of the book. I also felt like in this book there was a lot of repetition, which I can't blame people for in speaking because I repeat myself so much, but when you're writing and you've got like formal editors and you're an established writer, you should have people editing out that repetitive stuff. I understand that there is some like different perspectives throughout this book, and so those different perspectives are repeating things that other characters have already observed, but it could be done in a way where it's not so repetitive for information for the reader, or in some cases we don't even necessarily need to see certain characters receiving that information. So I understand in some cases it's necessary because you need to know that this character knows this thing, but have it edited so that it doesn't sound like the exact same sentence twice within a couple chapters of each other. So I think I rated this 3 stars, although it kind of feels like a 2.5 to me, so maybe I should go and edit that in Storygraph, which I just hate because I tend to like Charles Stross's work. And finally, I finished Leather and Sage by Taylor Sheapherd. This is a book that I got from NetGalley for review, and this was the other book along with the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle that really put me into a reading slump. I liked the premise. It's kind of like a spin on a vampire novel and like a vampire origin story, and it's supposed to be about like family ties and like when someone you love becomes a monster, do you still love them and how do you react to that? And I think the premise was great, and there were parts of the writing that I really liked where it just kind of flowed naturally, but the author seemed really intent on trying to make the speech and even the internal monologue of the characters like very dialect driven, which I felt was just inconsistent. And honestly, I loved the parts where there was no dialectical speech at all and it just kind of flowed. I thought that part of the author's writing was lovely, but then it very quickly moved back into this dialectical speech that didn't sound natural and didn't feel natural and just made it feel clunky. One prominent example that I remember is it seems like anytime there's a word that starts with A, instead of using like a word like the word around, it would be like apostrophe round. And another thing that the author seemed to try to do to make it very like colorful or whatever was every time they referred to like the main character's eyes or the eyes of the family in question, instead of just using the word eyes, like the eyes of the two sisters met, they would say their willow moss and kindling met, which the first time was like, okay, that's kind of like you're trying to describe that they've got this very particular color of like hazel-ish eyes, I would guess. But after like the 5th time, I was just like, just use eyes. This is clunky. I understand what you're trying to do. Once was fine, 5 times is too many. Please stop. So I would have enjoyed this book so much more if it had just been more simple language and if the author hadn't tried to get fancy with it. The other thing is this book is about like a family of witches, and there are a bunch of like spells written out and sprinkled throughout the book, but every time they have like a spell, the font for it in the book was just unreadable to me. I just skipped those entire sections because it just hurt my eyes to read. It would have been so slow, and I didn't really care. I'm not gonna like go and do spells. Maybe it was relevant to the plot, but I wouldn't know because I couldn't even read them. So that was all the books I read this month. It was a pretty bad reading month. I only read 1,681 pages, which is, let's see, 56 pages a day, and my goal is like 100 pages a day, so far cry from getting that done. I only read about half of what I intended to, and I didn't even touch a bunch of the books on my TBR that I intended to get to in November. So that wasn't great.